Wendy, welcome to WealthTalk today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, good to have you on. And we're diving into the property pillar today, and specifically step 6 in our roadmap, which is the strategy around HMOs. And we're talking about how to run a hands-free HMO portfolio, which I think is a dream for many people. We know that people strive to have more time freedom, Wendy, and of course the financial freedom as well. And you've got some great experience of why the HMO strategy can absolutely allow people to realize those dreams.
Well, I agree. I think that one of the biggest challenges that people have in investing in HMOs is that they think they've got to do it all themselves. So I'd like to share how you don't have to.
Yeah. So why don't we rewind a little bit, Wendy, so people know obviously your background and the experience that you've built up. So where did your property investing journey begin?
Well, I first started investing in property in 1996, or was it 1997? It was so long ago, I can't remember which year it was, but it was about 1996, 1997 when I bought my first investment property. Now, this was before buy-to-let mortgages had even been created. So I was in the phase of investing where you had to go to the bank to get a loan. So I had to write a business plan and take it to my business bank manager and ask him for a loan rather than a buy-to-let mortgage. And he approved the loan. And the reason was that it was a shared house. It was a shared student house that I was buying. It had 6 tenants in it, and it was, by all accounts, an HMO. But of course, the word HMO, house of multiple occupancy, hadn't been described in law and wasn't described in law for another few years. So it was just called a shared house, shared living. And that's how I got started.
Great. And I mean, we see now obviously so much property education available out there. Was there the same level of education, back then?
Well, the problem was, of course, the internet was still in its kind of nascent years, and so it was really hard to learn about property, except for going on very expensive courses. So at the time, I learned about it from friends, from other investors that I knew. I had subscriptions to various magazines that came through the door and newsletters. In fact, I remember one of them called Property Auction News. And this was a monthly newsletter that came through. And funnily enough, many years later, I met somebody at another networking event, and he had been a writer on this magazine. And I had been telling him about my journey and how I used to get this property auction news. And he said, "Oh, I used to write for Property Auction News." So I was blown away by that, because at the time I thought these people who wrote for these magazines must have been, extremely wealthy and experienced property investors. And this guy was, of course, he fitted the bill, but it was then I was speaking to him on the same terms, and I was very excited about that. But yeah, in those days, it was much harder there were no networking meetings. It was much harder to find information on property investing. And so I had to pick up bits and pieces as I went around the country. I bought properties at auction. That became my main strategy. And I often found myself to be in a room full of older men of, maybe they were black or Asian men, because they always look like a good deal. And here I was, a young white woman, sometimes with a child in tow, turning up at property auctions, feeling very much out of my depth and feeling very in the minority. And but yet finding good deals and investing in property. So and I did this really by recirculating the money I had. I did at that stage. I hadn't learned to raise money from investors. I wasn't using investor finance. I was using my own money, and I was just trying to be savvy about the deals that I secured and bought.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting there you talk about, working with other people and raising money. And that certainly comes further on down the journey, doesn't it? But at the beginning, you just have to take that first step. And often people hold back. They try and consume too much information, or they want everything lined up to be perfect. But in order to start your wealth building journey, you just have to do something, don't you?
Absolutely. I think that I realized that I couldn't just wait until everything was perfect. And sometimes I think because fear does play a large part in our behavior as human beings, and I think particularly when you're talking about investing and investing large sums of money, fear can become an overwhelming kind of force that holds us back, and therefore we procrastinate, or we think everything's got to be perfect before we can take action. But I've made mistakes. I've bought properties that didn't cash flow particularly well. I've put money into properties that later on I learned were not the right type of property. I bought an off-build property an off-build apartment in Portugal just before the global financial crash. Bad timing. I bought a new build property which didn't really ever go up much in value, because of course the first 10 years generally the premium you pay for new builds is sort of absorbed into the capital growth. But even with these experiences of making some mistakes and having some setbacks, I didn't stop. And I think it's like the rocket that's just landed on Mars. It was called Perseverance. And I think that, if you're going to go far in your property journey, you've got to see yourself a bit like a rocket. You're leaving Earth's atmosphere. You're leaving the safety of Earth. You're shooting off into the unknown. You've got a direction. You've got a goal. You want to land on that particular goal, that particular target. But you need to have a guidance system to get you there. You've also got to have enough fuel to get you there. And you've also got to have a plan. But ultimately, you've got to launch. If you never launch, you're never going to land. So my view is, it's no coincidence that the rocket was called Perseverance, because to me, that's a fantastic analogy for being a property investor.
Yeah, I think those are really important lessons, and it's good for people to hear that, you've made mistakes. Everyone has, right? You have to, in that process of just learning and moving forwards. So you talked about getting into property with buy-to-lets, which is probably where most people begin, Wendy. At what point did you then think, okay, it's time to maybe look at a different strategy? And what led you into the HMO strategy exactly?
Well, my first property, of course, was an HMO, which was, I suppose, purely coincidence. I wasn't really looking for an HMO at the time, and as I say, it wasn't really an HMO. It was a sort of shared property, shared student accommodation. But of course, I knew from day one that was making me very good cash flow. After that, I went into buy-to-let, and I bought some buy-to-let properties because I felt that they were easier to manage and they were more straightforward, and I wasn't responsible for the bills, whereas in the shared property I'd been responsible for some of the bills, not all of them actually. Some of the students did pay for them themselves. But after a few years, I realized that the cash flow I was getting from my buy-to-lets wasn't really going to particularly change my life. By then, my career had started to take off. I was doing a master's degree. I was focusing on my main career. But with a young family, I've got 4 boys, and my husband was working away from home. And I just found that in terms of my time, I had limited time. So therefore, looking at where I wanted to be in terms of my income from property and where I was at that time, I just thought this is going to take me too long. I'm not going to achieve it until I'm in my 60s at this rate. So I decided that I had to examine other types of property investing. And for me, one of the quickest and easiest ways to, if you like, step sideways was into HMOs. So I'd heard a lot about HMOs. I'd been on some training courses about various different property investments and strategies. And we decided that we would invest in a beta HMO, so a sort of test HMO local to where we lived. Because Andy, my partner, was nervous. Again, the fear factor held him back a little bit. And he said, well, let's just test it and see if we can make this work before we choose to launch. So we decided that we would do a beta HMO, so a small 4-bed HMO. And if the rooms rented well, and we had kind of set deadlines for how long we wanted to take to rent those rooms before we would count the project a success. If those rooms rented well, then we would expand. And sure enough, we did a fairly light refurb on this property because it was already in quite good condition. And within a month, all the rooms had rented out. We were making pretty good profit on that, much, much better, about 3 times the amount that we would have done if it was a single buy-to-let. And Andy was convinced and I was convinced. So we said, let's do it again. And that's really how the journey began into moving into HMOs.
Now you mentioned you were, working full time, was it at that point as well? And
Part time, I was working part time. Yeah.
okay, and how long was it after really beginning to focus on HMOs that you were able to then completely leave your job?
About 18 months later. So yes, we started investing in HMOs about the end of 2012, and then I gave up my job towards the end of 2014, and I then persisted in working in the property business. And then in 2015, Andy gave up his job. So just a couple of years later, he was able to leave as well. So by then we'd created about £5,000 to £5,500 a month net cash flow from our property business, which was just about enough for us to live on. It didn't fully replace Andy's salary, but it certainly gave us it gave us time. And actually, of course, because of the tax efficiencies of investing in property, he didn't have to earn as much money. Of course, he wasn't paying for his travel. The costs, he was living in London 3 days a week and having to rent a room. Actually, funnily enough, he lived in an HMO, which was tremendous research, I have to say. I'd always recommend you go and live in an HMO for a few weeks or a few months to learn what they're like, because that was really, really helpful for us when we started to develop our HMO portfolio. Andy would say, "Oh, you don't want to put the bins there; that won't work," and the kitchen shouldn't be on the second floor; it always has to be on the ground floor, and all sorts of insider knowledge that we wouldn't have had if he hadn't himself had to live in an HMO. But of course, those are still additional costs. And we negated all of those costs by now we were living both together at home and working from home. And so therefore, we didn't actually need to earn as much money as we had before. So it was a really good, really, really good time. It was very exciting to be able to leverage enough so that we could now no longer be employed by anybody. Nobody would tell us when to get up or what to do or how we should spend our days. What a tremendous feeling of freedom that brings.
Yeah, no, it's really good to hear the progression there from, a place of what we call financial insecurity, where there's not enough money coming from assets yet in order to completely replace the jobs, to a place of financial security when the assets are covering your outgoings. And then, of course, then the next target is to reach financial independence. So once you were at that point of security and you had your HMO portfolio, Wendy, how did you then move forwards from there? And did you begin to look at any other strategies?
At that point, we started to learn more about how to raise money from other people. We had already worked with a couple of investors up until that point, and we realized that because we had run out of our own money, that the only way really to grow the portfolio and grow the business would be to continue to find good ways to give other people a return and create win-wins. So that was at the point where we started to develop portfolios with other investors. And we also recognized that by creating a cookie cutter approach for our business, we didn't have to recreate the wheel each time. So that was really when I started to write our operations manual for our business. And as a result of writing the operations manual, it taught us how to find properties, how to fund properties, how to finish or refurb properties, how to fill properties. But finally, the key step was how to future-proof them. Because one of the things that we had seen happen in the past with many other property investors and our own property portfolio was that if you hadn't developed systems and processes, A, to maintain the properties and to continue to grow, but B, to release your time, all that we could see we were going to be heading into was this black hole of time and energy as we managed the growing portfolio, and neither of us wanted that. So we knew we had to create a system and a process whereby our time would be reduced every month, but our income would be increased every month. And for me, that's the nexus where future-proof comes in, because it allows you to outsource and to leverage and yet still be able to grow the portfolio. So that was what we focused on. And yes, along the way, we did commercial conversions. We've got commercial property. We have done other types of property as well. But we mostly still focused on the bread and butter of HMOs. We bought a couple of single lets along the way as well.
Mm. So I can see a nice 5F formula that you've got there. So does that lend itself, I imagine, to obviously then being able to help other people, and were, friends, family, connections beginning to ask you kind of, how you've done it and whether you could help them as well?
I started to be asked to go and speak at different property networking events. And my mentor said to me, Wendy, your system, your 5F system, you should write a book about it. And I thought, oh, writing a book, that sounds like a massive endeavor. Could I really ever write a book? But I did. And in fact, the second edition has just come out of my very first book, 101 Essential Tips for Running a Professional HMO, giving you time, money, and freedom. So I put my 5-step formula into the book, and that came out in October 2015. And yeah, as a result of that, people did start to then approach me to say, could you mentor me? Could you train me? How have you done this? How have you created a portfolio of cash flowing assets, which gives you time and money freedom? And so that was really how my next business, which is called HMO Success, was born out of that first year of being financially free and having the time to write a book, having the time to put into thinking about the future proofing aspect of our business, so that we had more time to be able to do what we wanted to do and not feel that we had to spend we had to now spend all our time managing our property portfolio, which is unfortunately where I think a lot of people find themselves after a few years. They've invested heavily. They now have a great cash flowing portfolio, but they're spending a lot of time managing it. And that wasn't what we wanted to do.
Yeah, so let's dive into that then, Wendy. Let's really talk about now how someone can run a hands-free HMO portfolio. And I guess there's people who are earlier in their journey, and there's people, as you just say, who may already have a number of HMOs but feel kind of trapped. So are there different approaches for the two sets of people? And how can someone who's already got some HMOs start to step back and put some systems in place?
Well, I think the key is if you're starting off, start the way you mean to carry on. So start with the end in mind. I think it's really crucial that you plan how you are going to grow and develop your HMO portfolio so that it is hands free. And that's a practice that starts from day one. It's much harder to shift later on. It's possible. And I want to give some help to those people who might find themselves in that position and thinking now, oh, I really want to get out of this business. I want to get out of running this business, but I don't know how to. So I'll come on to that. But initially, what I'd say is start with the end in mind. If you want to get to a point where you have a cash flowing HMO portfolio, but you're not running it yourself, I would recommend a number of things. First of all, you need to be thinking about leveraging and outsourcing from day one. So one of the lessons that I learned was the importance of having a process that you could then give to somebody else. So this was where our operations manual was incredibly important, because by operationalizing, I think that's a word, by operationalizing our systems, it meant that I could easily pick up a chunk of the workload and delegate it to somebody else. So I started to recruit members of our team. And I would say to them, okay, your job is written out in pages 15 to pages 21 of the operations manual. And in that operations manual, I went into a lot of detail. So I would go into the detail about the tools, the systems, the processes. Now, one of the other things that we've always maximized is profit. So a key area that I see mistakes being made by people is using expensive tools. And there is no need to use expensive tools. There's a lot of low cost or no cost tools out there that can help you run your business. So, for example, we don't use software. We don't use management software or landlord software. We use Google. We use Google Sheets and Google Forms. And up to, we now have a portfolio of over 150 rooms, and we've got other properties as well that we manage. And it's completely free. Now, we have moved on to G Suite, which is you pay a little bit more for G Suite every month. There's a little bit of subscription there. But at the lower levels, you don't have to pay anything. It's completely free. And it's very, very easy to set up. And it's very easy to use. Now, it might not look as sexy, and it might not, have all the functionality that maybe a piece of landlord software does, but it's completely free. And my view is what you want to be spending your money on is good staff. You want people who can run the processes, and you want to be able to manage and run the people. So your job should be to oversee the people and the team, and then the people and the team run the processes. But what you want to do is spend money on people, not on tools. So we try and keep our tools as low cost as possible. So I think having an operations manual, however small, however thin it might be, because you've only just started, is really the key to starting to systemize and leverage your business. Now, I think for somebody who already has property, they will have more experience and knowledge and insight to be able to do this really easily. And actually, what I found in working with my private clients is that when I've suggested to them they need to take some time out from their business and work on and not in their business, they've actually been really pleasantly surprised by how much they can write down very, very quickly about what they do. And actually, the process of doing that has also illuminated to them some of the areas where maybe they're not as efficient as they could be, and systems that maybe need a bit of a tweak or a change to work better for them. So I'd always start with the operations manual. And for me, having it broken down into those 5 steps covers everything. So feel free to copy it if you like.
Yeah. Now, I know one of the other things that often kind of puts people off, Wendy, is the compliance and the regulation around HMOs. So any words of advice there?
Compliance and regulation, you have to learn a significant amount in order to be able to remain compliant. And we teach that on our courses as well. We're really clear about what you need to learn and how to learn it. We're trying to make it as interesting and as accessible as possible. But actually, it's only hard the first time. Once you've learned how to do it once, it's a bit like driving a car. You don't have to keep taking your test again. You don't have to keep learning how to do a 3-point turn. Once you've learned how to do a 3-point turn, you can do it in different streets, different parts of the UK, and different parts of the world. You don't have to keep relearning it. So while there might be a little bit of a learning curve here, if your aim is to create a handful of cash flowing properties, which replaces your job income, you only need to learn it once, and then you just rinse and repeat it. So yes, there are aspects to learn about compliance, there are aspects to learn about regulation, and it's a case of really understanding how they apply to your HMO. And again, a useful tool for this would be Google Calendar. So in Google Calendar, we always put in when our gas safety certificates are needed, when the alarm test certificate is needed, when we need to reapply for the HMO license, and it becomes a routine. And then you can again delegate to somebody else to oversee and manage that and plan for that. And it suddenly is no longer a headache because it's systemized, it's routinized, and it's delegated. So you can leverage it. So you do not need to be the one phoning up the plumber to organize the gas safety check. You do not need to be the person organizing, some safety check in your HMO. Somebody else can be doing that for you while you get on with the important job of building your wealth.
Now, we know from our members that for many people, Wendy, to kind of really hit that point of financial security and break free of that time for money trap, it's around about £5,000 a month. And that could be less for some people, more for others. But, roughly speaking, what are we talking about? 5 HMOs here to hit that target?
Yes, I would say about 5 HMOs. For me, it was more like 9 because I had a joint venture with another investor. So we did 50-50 on our properties. So for 4 of those properties that I had, I was only getting 50% of the cash flow. So that's something to look out for, that if you're doing a joint venture, then you're going to have to do more properties. But the benefit, of course, of doing a joint venture is that you're probably not using your own money. So there is you're getting 50% of the cash flow, but of course, if it hasn't cost you anything, it's an additional 50% that you wouldn't have had otherwise. So yeah, I probably had more than 5 HMOs at that point, maybe 9 or 10, which was a very good, stable position to be in. I would also say that you need to calculate for voids. You're going to have some level of voids. You're going to have some level of maintenance. So erring on the side of caution is always wise, and having some level of savings. I would recommend that people have between 3 and 6 months worth of savings in the bank, and also trying to reduce consumer and expensive debt. I think these are all very good money management approaches to have. I'm very much in favour of using debt to buy assets, but I'm not in favour of using debt to buy fripperies. So focus on reducing consumer credit, consumer debt, increasing debt that's leveraged against assets, which gives you cash flow.
And one of our recent guests, Wendy, actually talked about how when he sat down for the weekend with his wife and looked at their portfolio, they realized that just by reducing some of their outgoings and reducing their expenses, they actually were able to hit that financial independence figure. So do you have any tips at all for how someone can maximize their income from HMOs, Wendy?
So I would say that what I see, some of the mistakes that people make, first of all, not understanding the impact that voids has on your business. Now, occasionally I'll speak to a landlord and they'll say, well, I'm not renting that room out for anything less than £120 a week. That's a £120 a week room any day of the week. And I'll say, brilliant. Well, how many days of the week is it rented right now? Oh, it's not, it's empty. Ah, okay. You have to realize that the HMO market is very fluid. It's not like a pint of milk or a tin of peaches. The price doesn't vary. The price can vary massively. It's not just by a small percentage that it varies, or that it's standardized. Generally a pint of milk is fairly standardized across England. But that's not true of HMO rooms. There is no standardized price for an HMO room. Your room is only what somebody will pay for it, as is true of property, actually. So in terms of your flexibility about how much your room should be rented for, try not to have a fixed price in your own mind. And that goes for increasing your prices as well. If you've got plenty of demand, if you've got plenty of people looking at your rooms, then maybe this is an opportunity to actually increase your prices, maybe by a small amount, a few percentage points. But this can really make the difference between having a profitable and a non-profitable HMO. Outgoings. If you're not regularly assessing your outgoings, your utility prices, and checking on those, and again, this isn't something you necessarily need to do. You can outsource it. You can get a virtual assistant to do this for you. We take a check of our meter readings across our portfolio every month, and it gives us an idea of how much gas and electricity is being used, and in those properties that have got water meters. That way we can see if there's a spike in usage or demand, and we can address it. Sometimes we have spotted errors, for example. We have spotted leaks. We have found that in one of our properties, the tenants had left the immersion heater on for about 6 weeks. So they had plenty of hot water at the drop of a button, the flick of a switch, the turn of a tap. They had as much as they needed, but of course we were paying for it. So we said to them, please turn off the immersion heater. And of course our fuel bills came right down. But this was only predicted because we had our meter readings. So this kind of data is extremely helpful when you're trying to maximize your profit in an HMO, having regular data that you can look at. So how many days has one of your rooms been empty for? How many views have you had of your advert, either on Spare Room or other sites that you might use? Are you utilizing some of the other channels, such as your own website, your Facebook, Instagram, and are you doing offline marketing as well? We seem to have forgotten that actually offline marketing is just as effective as online marketing these days. And there are plenty of people who will respond to a leaflet or a card in a shop window or an invitation by a friend to look at a room. So we have a policy that incentivizes people to give us referrals for tenants. And these are things which I think they are small tweaks, but they can make a big difference to your bottom line. And it's about having a very sound business approach. I think with single buy-to-lets, It's reasonably easy to buy them, reasonably easy to let them out, and really to set and forget. You don't have to do much work with them. You can manage them yourself, or you could utilize an agent. HMOs are definitely more work because you have a more concentrated number of people living in one property. So they do take more work. But, it's only about mindset. This is not work that you have to do. It's simply about creating a system and a process, a flywheel, if you like, that gathers the information and reacts to the information. And you're simply the person who is the architect of that process and then allows other people to run it for you. And when that happens, when you can create that, it's a very, very powerful wealth building tool.
Now, 2020 was one of your best years ever, Wendy, despite the lockdown and pandemic going on. Why was that?
It's very hard to know, Christian. I wish I could be, have a really deep insight into why 2020 was a good year. We had some bad debt, so I can't say that we didn't have any problems. It wasn't a perfect year. We didn't have 100% occupancy across 12 months. We still had a couple of troublesome tenants. But overall, yes, it was one of our best years. It was our best year ever, actually. And maybe that was because tenants weren't moving so much. We had stability of population, so tenants were staying in our HMOs for longer. We regularly reached 100% occupancy. With 150 rooms, it's unlikely you would keep 100% occupancy all the time, but we regularly hit 100% occupancy. And I remember in December we hit 100% occupancy, and we were all celebrating over Christmas, which is great. So I think it was perhaps a mixture of offering great service, great accommodation, and having very, very responsive team, having a very responsive team. I think tenants like that. They like to know that they have somebody they can call on who will respond to their questions or queries or comments very quickly. And we've always prided ourselves on offering a really good system to our tenants. I think also during COVID, we were very, very quick to respond with the COVID policy. We issued COVID posters to all our properties. We were very clear with our tenants about things like rent delays or rent arrears, what they should do. If they needed to apply for a reduction in rent, how they could go about doing that, and what we would do to collect the arrears. So certain policies were very quickly communicated to tenants, and that, I think, gave them clarity and gave them certainty about the way we were managing in that rather uncertain time. And then I think as the year progressed, we also made sure that we implemented very good cleaning methodologies with our cleaners and with the contractors and the team who would go into the properties. So we carried on doing viewings when we were allowed to, but we did them very safely. So we also had always done online viewings. We'd often done video viewings, and this became more popular as well. So I think we were fast to adapt to the changing nature of what was going on, and we were able to support tenants, but we were also able to still keep the business vibrant and alive and growing. And in fact, we did an HMO conversion in the middle of last year, and 2 months later, we had it all fully tenanted and rented out. So even during COVID, we were still working with our builder, and we were still developing property. We didn't stop.
Mm. I know you keep a keen eye on the economy as well, Wendy, and how that affects local impact for property investors. So where do you see the future of HMOs at the moment?
I think that's very strong. Despite quite a number of people selling up, I also see quite a lot of HMOs coming onto the market. And I suspect that's because those people are finding that they are struggling to rent their rooms, or they're struggling to maintain them in the face of some quite stiff competition. But what I would say is that when there is a need, if your product or service meets a need, you will always be able to sell it. So one of the key areas that I'm always looking at is, as you say, the market, the economy, understanding what's happening in the world today. So I think moving forward this year, of course, furlough will be coming to an end. And I think that's going to provide somewhat of kind of test, a little bit of a thermometer for the general economy. We'll see whether indeed employers are creating the jobs which we're led to believe they are creating, and will some of those people who are currently furloughed go into new jobs, or will those businesses come back to life and those furloughed individuals will just go straight back into their employment? Or will we see an increase in unemployment? Now, whichever way the economy goes, HMOs always provide a level of accommodation that's needed, because particularly if you're providing all-inclusive accommodation with bills included, you are always going to be in demand. You're always going to have somebody who does not have the money to pay for bills, or doesn't really have the inclination to pay for bills individually. They don't want to set up a separate direct debit for gas and electricity and council tax. They want to have it all included. So it's a very powerful model where you just simply pay one price every week or every month and get everything included. There aren't many standards or types of accommodation where you get that. So I believe there's going to be very, very steady demand continuing through 2021. I also think we're going to see some changes in working patterns. Often, and we saw this after the last global financial crisis, was that people know they've got to move around more to get jobs. So we're going to see people moving into and out of cities. We're going to see people moving into areas where there are going to be different types of jobs, distribution jobs, warehouse type jobs. Now, those kind of jobs are not particularly highly paid, but they do often require suddenly, a huge increase in the working population, their working clients. And where are those people going to live? If you've got an HMO near to an Amazon warehouse, you're going to be absolutely fine, because that's exactly the kind of accommodation that often those workers need when they're first moving into the area. And I think even post-Brexit, although we have seen some people go back to Europe, some people decide that they don't want to stay in the UK anymore, or unable to stay in the UK anymore, we do know that immigration from other parts of the world has been steadily growing. And I think once we get out of lockdown and the travel restrictions are removed, I think we're going to see that even more than ever, because one of the things that COVID has definitely done is increase the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And this is not only just locally, but it's also internationally. And I suspect we're going to see many more people wishing to come to the UK, A, because we have a strong healthcare system and a strong NHS, B, because we have good other support services, but C, because potentially we have very good employment prospects too. And again, people who come to the UK from abroad, they can't afford to rent somewhere individually. And in fact, quite often they don't want to because they're sending money back home. But also they're not able to buy because they're not mortgageable. So I'm very, very confident about HMOs moving forward.
Well, look, I really appreciate you sharing everything that you have done with us today, Wendy. It's been really informative. If people would like to find out a bit more about the work that you're doing, obviously your book, and you have your own podcast as well, HMO Success, where's the best place for them to head to online?
So you could come to my website, which is www.hmosuccess.co.uk. You can email me, wendy@hmosuccess.co.uk. Those are probably two of the best ways. You can find me on Facebook, Wendy Whittaker-Large. I'm on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn, all the social media platforms. You know the drill.
Wendy, thanks so much for being a great guest on Wealth Talk today.